September 2024, art historian Dr. Caroline Mitchell attended an estate auction in Richmond, Virginia, hoping to find period pieces for her university's American history collection. Among the items from the Blackwood family estate was an ornate, gilt-framed portrait that caught her attention, not for its artistic merit, but for something unsettling about its composition. The oil painting depicted Colonel James Blackwood, a distinguished Virginia gentleman, seated in his library sometime during 1899. Blackwood wore formal evening attire and held a leather-bound book, every detail suggesting prosperity and respectability, typical of Southern aristocracy during the post-Reconstruction era. The portrait's technical execution was masterful, painted by Richmond artist Harrison Vail, whose signature appeared in the lower right corner. Vail was known for his portraits of prominent Virginia families, and this work demonstrated his skill in capturing both physical likeness and social status through careful attention to clothing, posture, and setting. However, Dr. Mitchell noticed something that made her examine the painting more closely. Behind Colonel Blackwood, partially visible through the library's tall windows, stood another figure. At first glance, the man appeared to be simply part of the background scenery, perhaps a servant or groundskeeper working on the estate grounds. But closer inspection revealed disturbing details. The background figure was a black man, but his positioning and dress seemed incongruous with typical depictions of enslaved or formerly enslaved people in post-Civil War Southern art. He stood, upright with dignified bearing, wearing what appeared to be formal clothing rather than work attire. Most unsettling was the man's gaze. Unlike typical background figures who were usually depicted looking away or engaged in subservient activities, this man appeared to be looking directly at Colonel Blackwood with an expression that seemed challenging rather than deferential. Dr. Mitchell purchased the portrait for $2,400, sensing that this painting might contain historical significance beyond its apparent value as a family heirloom. She suspected the background figure might represent something important about post-Civil War Virginia society that had been hidden in plain sight for over a century. Research into Harrison Vail's career revealed that he was one of Richmond's most prominent portrait artists during the 1890s, known for his meticulous attention to detail and his ability to capture the social aspirations of Virginia's post-war elite. Vail's client list included governors, railroad executives, and prominent plantation owners who were rebuilding their fortunes after the Civil War. Vail's artistic training at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts had exposed him to progressive ideas about art and society, making him somewhat unusual among Southern artists of his era. His correspondence, preserved in the Virginia Historical Society, revealed complex attitudes about race and social change in the post-Reconstruction South. Colonel James Blackwood emerged as a fascinating and controversial figure in Virginia's post-Civil War history. Born in 1845, he had served as a Confederate cavalry officer during the final years of the war, surrendering with Lee at Appomattox when he was only 20 years old. After the war, Blackwood rebuilt his family's tobacco plantation through a combination of shrewd business practices and political connections. By 1899, he owned over 3,000 acres in Hanover County and employed dozens of formerly enslaved people as sharecroppers and tenant farmers. However, Blackwood's post-war activities revealed a more complex character than typical Confederate veterans. Court records showed that he had been involved in several legal disputes defending the rights of black workers on his property, taking positions that put him at odds with many of his white neighbors. Local newspaper accounts from the 1890s described Blackwood as an unusual gentleman who maintained peculiar arrangements with his black employees. These cryptic references suggested that his labor practices differed significantly from typical post-war plantation operations. The 1899 portrait was commissioned during a particularly contentious period in Blackwood's life, when he faced criticism from white neighbors and scrutiny from federal authorities investigating labor practices in Virginia's agricultural regions. These discoveries suggested that the background figure in the portrait might be connected to the controversial aspects of Blackwood's post-war career and the complex racial dynamics of 1890s Virginia society. Advanced imaging analysis conducted at Virginia Commonwealth University revealed previously invisible details about the mysterious background figure. Digital enhancement showed that the man was approximately 50 years old, well-dressed in a dark suit and tie, and positioned deliberately within the artist's composition rather than accidentally included. The enhanced image revealed that the background figure held what appeared to be legal documents or papers, suggesting his presence was related to business rather than manual labor. His posture and bearing indicated education and authority, rather than the subservient positioning typical of black figures in post-war Southern art. Comparison with photographic records from the Virginia Historical Society's collection of Reconstruction-era portraits identified potential matches for the mysterious figure. The most promising lead was Samuel Freeman, a formerly enslaved person who had become a prominent civil rights lawyer in Richmond during the 1890s. Freeman's career represented an extraordinary journey from slavery to legal prominence during one of the most challenging periods in American race relations. Born enslaved on a Hanover County plantation in 1849, he had learned to read secretly during childhood and escaped to Union lines during the Civil War. After the war, Freeman worked his way through Howard University Law School, graduating in 1878, and returning to Virginia to establish a legal practice serving the black community. His clients included sharecroppers, tenant farmers, and small business owners navigating the complex legal landscape of the post-Reconstruction South. Court records showed that Freeman had represented several black workers in disputes with white landowners during the 1890s, including cases involving workers on Colonel Blackwood's plantation. These legal cases centered on contract disputes, wage theft, and working conditions that violated emerging labor protection laws. Freeman's presence in Blackwood's photograph began to make sense within the context of ongoing legal relationships between the two men. The photograph may have been commissioned during a period when Freeman was representing Blackwood's workers in negotiations or legal proceedings. The positioning of Freeman's figure, dignified, direct, and holding official documents, suggested that photographer Harrison Vail was documenting a significant relationship that challenged conventional racial hierarchies of the 1890s South. Richmond court records from 1898-1899 revealed extensive legal proceedings involving Colonel Blackwood's plantation and the rights of his black workers. Samuel Freeman appeared as attorney of record in multiple cases that challenged traditional post-war labor arrangements and sought to establish more equitable working conditions. The central case involved 23 black families who worked Blackwood's tobacco fields under sharecropping agreements that Freeman argued violated Virginia's emerging labor protection laws. The workers claimed that Blackwood was deducting excessive fees for housing, tools, and supplies, leaving them in perpetual debt despite productive harvests. Freeman's legal arguments were groundbreaking for the 1890s South. He contended that post-war sharecropping arrangements that kept workers in permanent debt constituted a form of involuntary servitude prohibited by the 13th Amendment. This legal theory challenged the entire economic foundation of post-Reconstruction Southern agriculture. Court transcripts revealed that Colonel Blackwood had initially opposed Freeman's involvement, but gradually came to respect the lawyer's legal expertise and commitment to fair treatment of workers. Blackwood eventually agreed to modify his labor contracts to address Freeman's concerns about exploitative practices. The legal proceedings attracted attention from federal authorities investigating peonage and involuntary servitude in southern states. Justice Department records showed that Blackwood's plantation was among several Virginia operations under scrutiny for potentially illegal labor practices. Freeman's success in negotiating improved conditions for Blackwood's workers established important legal precedents for worker rights in Virginia agriculture. The agreements included provisions for fair accounting of debts, reasonable deductions for supplies, and workers' rights to seek independent legal representation. However, these progressive labor arrangements created significant controversy among Blackwood's white neighbors, who viewed his cooperation with Freeman as a dangerous precedent that threatened traditional racial and economic hierarchies. The timing of the 1899 portrait coincided with the conclusion of these legal proceedings, suggesting that the painting may have been commissioned to commemorate the successful resolution of the labor disputes and the unusual partnership between Blackwood and Freeman. Department of Justice records revealed that Colonel Blackwood's plantation had been under federal investigation for suspected peonage violations since 1897. Federal agents suspected that many Southern landowners were using debt arrangements to keep formerly enslaved people in conditions approaching slavery, violating federal civil rights laws. Special Agent Robert Morrison had been assigned to investigate labor practices throughout Virginia's tobacco-growing regions. Morrison's reports, preserved in the National Archives, described a systematic pattern of exploitation where black workers were trapped in cycles of debt that prevented them from leaving their employers. The federal investigation focused on plantation owners who used company stores, inflated supply costs, and manipulative accounting practices to ensure that workers never earned enough to pay off their debts. These arrangements effectively created involuntary servitude despite the formal abolition of slavery. Morrison's surveillance of Blackwood's plantation initially suggested similar exploitative practices. However, the agent's reports noted significant changes in labor arrangements during 1898, coinciding with Samuel Freeman's legal intervention on behalf of the workers. Federal investigators discovered that Blackwood had begun implementing revolutionary labor practices that provided workers with unprecedented rights and protections. These included written contracts, independent accounting of debts, and workers' rights to legal representation in disputes with management. Morrison's reports praised Blackwood's cooperation with federal authorities and his willingness to modify traditional labor arrangements to comply with federal civil rights laws. The plantation became a model for legal labor practices that other Southern landowners were encouraged to adopt. However, Blackwood's progressive labor policies created tension with local white communities who viewed his cooperation with federal agents and black lawyers as a betrayal of Southern traditions and racial hierarchies. The federal investigation concluded in early 1899 with Blackwood's plantation receiving commendation for implementing fair labor practices. The portrait was commissioned shortly after this federal recognition, possibly to commemorate Blackwood's successful navigation of the investigation. Samuel Freeman's prominent positioning in the portrait reflected his crucial role in transforming exploitative labor arrangements into legal, equitable working relationships that satisfied federal civil rights requirements. Analysis of Harrison Vale's artistic choices in the 1899 portrait revealed deliberate decisions that challenged conventional Southern art traditions and social expectations. Vale's positioning of Samuel Freeman as a dignified, equal figure rather than a subservient background element represented a radical artistic statement for its time and place. Comparison with other Southern portraits from the 1890s showed that black figures, when included at all, were typically depicted as servants, laborers, or decorative elements that reinforced white social dominance. Vale's decision to show Freeman as an equal participant in the scene violated these artistic conventions. Vale's correspondence with Northern art critics revealed his frustration with Southern artistic traditions that reflected and reinforced racial hierarchies. The artist wrote that he sought to document truth rather than perpetuate comfortable lies about post-war Southern society. The portrait's composition used sophisticated visual techniques to suggest equality between Blackwood and Freeman. Both men are shown in profile, neither dominating the other's space. Freeman's formal attire and dignified bearing match Blackwood's presentation, suggesting mutual respect rather than racial hierarchy. Vale's use of lighting created symbolic meaning throughout the portrait. Freeman is illuminated by natural light from the window, suggesting enlightenment and moral clarity, while Blackwood sits in the darker interior, perhaps representing the moral complexity of his position as a white landowner seeking redemption. The artist's decision to include Freeman's legal documents as a prominent visual element emphasized the lawyer's professional status and the legitimate business relationship between the two men. This detail challenged viewers' assumptions about appropriate relationships between white and black men in the 1890s South. Vale's artistic statement was remarkable for its historical context. Creating such a portrait required courage from both the artist and his subject, as it violated social conventions and potentially exposed both men to criticism and retaliation from white supremacist neighbors. The portrait represented one of the earliest artistic documentations of interracial cooperation and mutual respect in post-Reconstruction Southern art, preserved for over a century until modern historians could appreciate its radical significance. Local newspaper archives revealed that the 1899 portrait created significant controversy within Richmond's white society when it was first displayed. The Richmond Dispatch published several letters criticizing Colonel Blackwood for elevating Negro presumption and encouraging dangerous social mixing through his association with Samuel Freeman. White neighbors organized informal boycotts of Blackwood's tobacco products, pressuring Richmond merchants to refuse his crops and attempting to isolate him economically. These efforts reflected widespread white resistance to any challenges to traditional racial hierarchies during the post-Reconstruction period. The Hanover County Board of Supervisors passed a resolution condemning excessive familiarity between the races and warning that such arrangements threatened the natural order of Southern society. The resolution specifically mentioned Blackwood's labor practices as setting dangerous precedents for other landowners. However, the portrait also attracted support from unexpected sources. Several Richmond clergymen praised Blackwood's treatment of his workers as reflecting Christian principles of justice and fairness. Progressive newspapers in northern cities reprinted stories about the portrait as evidence of positive social change in the South. Samuel Freeman faced even more intense criticism from white supremacist groups who viewed his prominence in the portrait as evidence of dangerous black aspirations toward social equality. Freeman received death threats and faced attempts to disbar him from practicing law in Virginia courts. The black community's response was more complex. Some community leaders praised Freeman's success and the recognition represented by his inclusion in the portrait. However, others worried that such visibility might provoke white retaliation against the broader black community. Federal authorities monitored the controversy surrounding the portrait, concerned that it might trigger broader racial violence. Justice Department correspondence showed that agents were prepared to intervene if tensions escalated beyond verbal criticism and economic pressure. The portrait's controversial nature ensured that it remained largely hidden from public view for decades, displayed only in Blackwood's private residence rather than public galleries where it might have attracted additional criticism. The controversy surrounding the 1899 portrait had lasting consequences for both Colonel Blackwood and Samuel Freeman, shaping their careers and reputations for years to come. Blackwood's tobacco business suffered significant losses due to white boycotts, forcing him to find new markets in northern cities where his progressive labor practices were viewed more favorably. Economic pressure eventually forced Blackwood to sell portions of his plantation to maintain financial stability. However, he used the proceeds to establish a fund supporting education for black children in Hanover County, creating additional controversy among white neighbors who opposed any efforts to improve black educational opportunities. Samuel Freeman's legal practice expanded significantly following the publicity surrounding the portrait. Black workers throughout Virginia sought his representation in labor disputes, and his success in the Blackwood case established him as the region's leading civil rights attorney. However, Freeman faced constant harassment and threats that limited his effectiveness and endangered his family's safety. In 1903, he relocated his practice to Washington, D.C., where he could work more safely while continuing to serve Virginia clients through correspondence and periodic visits. The portrait itself disappeared from public view for decades, stored in the Blackwood family's private collection, where it remained largely forgotten. Family members rarely discussed the painting or its historical significance, preferring to avoid the controversy it had generated. Harrison Vale's career also suffered from the portrait's notoriety. Conservative white patrons avoided commissioning work from an artist associated with radical social positions, forcing Vale to seek clients among Richmond's small progressive community and northern visitors. However, Vale's artistic reputation was enhanced among progressive circles, and his work was featured in northern exhibitions promoting racial reconciliation. The 1899 portrait became his most famous work, though it remained largely hidden from Southern audiences. The legal precedents established through Freeman's representation of Blackwood's workers influenced subsequent civil rights cases throughout the South, providing a foundation for later challenges to exploitative labor practices and racial discrimination. The portrait remained in private hands until 2024, when Dr. Caroline Mitchell's purchase brought it back to scholarly attention. Her research revealed the historical significance of what had been dismissed as simply another Victorian family portrait with unusual background details. Digital imaging technology allowed researchers to enhance and analyze details that had been invisible to earlier viewers. The enhanced images confirmed Samuel Freeman's identity and revealed the sophisticated artistic techniques Harrison Vale had used to convey complex social and racial messages. Genealogical research revealed that both the Blackwood and Freeman families had descendants living in Virginia, many of whom were unaware of their ancestors' collaborative relationship during the 1890s. The portrait's rediscovery enabled family reunions and shared exploration of their intertwined histories. Legal historians recognize the Freeman-Blackwood case as an important but forgotten precedent in American civil rights law. Freeman's successful challenge to exploitative sharecropping arrangements predated more famous civil rights victories by several decades. Art historians praise the portrait as a rare example of progressive social commentary in post-Reconstruction Southern art. Vale's willingness to challenge artistic conventions reflected broader cultural tensions about race and equality during the 1890s. The portrait was donated to the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, where it became the centerpiece of an exhibition about post-Civil War racial cooperation and civil rights advocacy. The exhibition attracted national attention and sparked important conversations about forgotten aspects of Southern history. Educational programs used the portrait to teach students about the complexity of post-Reconstruction society and the individuals who challenged racial hierarchies despite significant personal risks. The painting became a powerful tool for exploring historical nuance and moral courage. Modern civil rights organizations embraced the portrait as evidence that racial cooperation and legal advocacy had deep historical roots in Virginia and the South, challenging narratives that portrayed civil rights activism as a purely 20th century phenomenon. The rediscovery of the 1899 portrait transformed understanding of post-Reconstruction Virginia history and highlighted forgotten stories of interracial cooperation and civil rights advocacy. Colonel Blackwood and Samuel Freeman's collaborative relationship demonstrated that progressive racial attitudes existed in the South decades before the modern civil rights movement. Dr. Caroline Mitchell's research was published in the Journal of Southern History, establishing the portrait as one of the most significant artistic documents of post-Civil War racial progress. Her work demonstrated how careful analysis of historical artifacts could reveal hidden stories about American social development. The Virginia General Assembly passed a resolution honoring Samuel Freeman as a pioneering civil rights attorney whose work established important legal precedents for worker protection and racial equality. Freeman's grave in Washington, D.C., received a historical marker recognizing his contributions to American civil rights law. Colonel Blackwood's descendants worked with Freeman's family to establish a scholarship fund supporting law students interested in civil rights advocacy. The fund specifically encourages students to research forgotten cases and legal precedents from the post-Reconstruction era. Harrison Vale was recognized posthumously as a progressive artist whose work challenged social conventions and documented important moments in American racial history. Art museums throughout the South began searching their collections for similar works that might contain hidden social commentary. The portrait inspired additional research into forgotten examples of post-Civil War racial cooperation, revealing that such relationships were more common than previously understood. Scholars discovered numerous cases of white and black Southerners working together, despite social pressure and legal obstacles. Educational curricula now include the Freeman-Blackwood case as an example of how individuals could challenge unjust systems through legal advocacy and moral courage. The portrait serves as a visual reminder that progress requires both institutional change and personal relationships across racial lines. The shocking truth about the man in the background had revealed a powerful story of justice, cooperation, and moral courage that had been hidden in plain sight for over a century, demonstrating how historical artifacts can preserve important lessons about American values and social progress.